Hello, everyone. Welcome to an all new episode of the Indic Paradigm on the Indic Explorer channel. Please do comment, like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Now, when we talk about culture, usually the discussion ranges about the past. But there's a certain aspect of culture that is futuristic. And the culture of the future is to a very good extent determined also by successful entrepreneurs and businesses and corporate culture is kind of the trend leader as far as the culture of the future goes. So to kind of demystify the current the trends of culture in the corporate world in the recent past, especially after COVID, and as well as certain futuristic trends, I have with me Roshan Cariappa. Welcome to the show, Roshan.
Hey, thanks so much, Vineet. Really appreciate that. You got me on your podcast, and you've been doing some interesting work. So fantastic! Congratulations to you.
And for the viewers of the show, Roshan is one of the earliest friends of this podcast, and a lot of the good production settings that you see here has a lot to do with him and his team. So, among other things, Roshan hosts the Startup Operator as well as the Bharat Varta podcast. Is there anything else you would like to talk about yourself, Roshan?
Nothing, but I think for the purpose of this podcast, maybe useful to mention that I've spent the last 14 or 15 years at early stage, growth stage startups across sales, product, and marketing roles. So I've been a startup guy through and through, right? And I've seen that the Indian startup ecosystem evolve, right, through multiple stages over the last 15 years. And yeah, this is a fantastic topic because I think startups are the cultural zeitgeist now, right? I mean, they're living room conversations. People ask about valuations and revenue and funding and whatnot in everyday conversations. So yeah, I mean, this is a good gist of a podcast topic to start with. Yeah.
Sure. So the current news making trend is how these big companies, whether it's Meta, Microsoft, Amazon, there were job firings around 11,000 people in Meta, 10,000 people in Amazon. Twitter, of course, there was a different issue altogether with the change of ownership and all of that. A lot of these companies have seen a lot of job losses, even Netflix, Byju's. What are the specific reasons why so many tech companies at one go have seen so many job losses?
See, in one line, I mean, they're trying to fix their balance sheets, right? I mean, the macroeconomic environment has changed. It's not the optimism of 2021. It's the recession of 2022 and 23, right? And so people are just being real about that. Also, this is kind of cyclical as well. I mean, periodically, companies do tend to cut the bloat when times are hard. Sometimes I think for a long period of time, I mean, people don't do that. They don't give enough, importance to that, and it just comes to a point where they have to do it, right? Where your normal churn is not enough to sort of get rid of all of the deadwood, so to speak, right? And if you look at indicators like revenue per employee and so on, right? I mean, these have been declining significantly over the last few years, right? And you mentioned, Meta cut around 11,000 people, right? There's still about 76,000 employees worldwide, right? I mean, 2.5, $3 billion users, whatever, but it's still a website. Okay. And if you look at, how they've hired over the last 3 or 4 years, they've been adding, something like 25, 30%, even 40% more employees every year, right? So even after the 11,000 headcount, I mean, they're significantly more in headcount than they were in 2020 or 2021, right? So I mean, that kind of gives you a bit of perspective in terms of the amount of bloat that there were in these systems, right? The other is this whole growth at all costs mindset, right? I mean, so in good times, I mean, people think that nothing bad can ever happen and everyone is bullish, everyone is kind of optimistic, and people go for growth, right? I mean, they don't They don't recognize that there are things like sustainability, profitability, and those kind of things are very, very important. They tend to ignore these things in the short run. And that's just the way it is, right? I mean, that's been happening for as long as businesses have existed. But I guess the scale and the amplitude of it is a lot more these days, right? I mean, now that the world economy is a lot more connected and it's a lot more bigger. But at times like these, right? I mean, when I say at times like these, I mean these are desperate times. So if you look at some of the companies that you mentioned, Microsoft is down about 25-26%, Amazon is down about 45%, Meta is down 67%, Google is down about 30% or so. And here in India, you've seen when 2021 we raised about $40 billion in venture funding. I mean, this year I would hazard a guess and say it would probably be about a third of that, right? So all of this is in tune with the macroeconomic condition. I mean, we're expecting a recession, right? And we're expecting consumers to cut their spending and businesses to be tight about their purse strings and so on. And so I think in anticipation, everyone's kind of fixing their balance sheets, right? And look at, you mentioned some of the Indian startups, right? I mean, look at Byju's. Can you guess how many employees they had?
Not sure. Maybe
take a wild guess.
What, 10,000?
They had 35,000 employees, man. I mean,
wow. That's a startup.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I mean, so now I understand, I mean, they might be doing some work that requires 35,000 employees, but really, so a lot of these folks are, the numbers were way out of whack. And the business models aren't really there to kind of justify that kind of monies, right? We'll talk about more about that, but in a just this is what it is, right? Macroeconomic conditions have turned, and all of these folks have been forced to fix their balance sheets, basically.
I want to ask you here: these companies, did they firstly, why did they grow so fast during the pandemic, right? And what happened, right? I mean, is it a coincidence because post-pandemic, they seem to have then tapered off. So, and these are all tech giants, right? These are not. So, I'm going to have this discussion at two levels. One is these tech giants like Facebook, Amazon, where the problems are different, and the other is the startup system where they are a lot more nimble, right? So, with regards to the tech giants, what happened post-pandemic?
See, it was a combination of factors, right? I mean, one is after the shock of the COVID pandemic, there was a lot of surplus cash in the system, right? I mean, a lot of government spending, a lot of doles, and so on and so forth. So there was a lot of cash in the market, right? Very low interest rates, record low interest rates, in fact, and there was a lot of dry powder to go around, right? So in general, there's a lot of money in the market. That reflected in the amount of fundraise that the startups did as well, right? I mean, 2021 year was a remarkable year for us. I mean, $40 billion by Indian startups. So while there was a lot of liquidity in the market, I think the other thing also is that because of lockdowns, because of increased screen time and so on and so forth, digitization kind of ramped up big time, right? I mean, they say that there are years when nothing happens and there are years when decades happen, right? And this was one of those periods, right? I mean, in whatever sector you consider, I mean, digitization just amplified 10x over the last couple of years and leapfrogged significantly, right? And so, I mean, because of this, the tech companies, whether it is the larger tech folks or the, smaller startups, both of these benefited because their mode of delivery, right, of the product or service is primarily online, right? I mean, it's internet-based product or service. And yeah, it was tough not to be optimistic at that time, right? I mean, especially think about what the Geo revolution has done in India, right? I mean, we have 600 million internet users, soon to be around 900 million by 2025 or so, and so there was a lot of optimism that this market, right, will yield a lot of revenue and whatnot, right? And yeah, I mean, I suppose that is some of the reasons why you saw that kind of growth and the crazy valuations and whatnot.
But many people were saying that a lot of trends that happened during the pandemic will remain as residual trends even post-pandemic. Why did that not happen? Is there?
See, we're settling on a hybrid, right? See, the thing is that, look at EdTech, for example, right? Everyone thought that schools and colleges and universities will just, overnight disappear, right? I mean, that hasn't happened, obviously, right? So I guess, people had to look at it, things in a little more tempered way, right? And you have a sort of a hybrid settling down right now, right? Whether it's schools or universities, you have obviously meaningful and online edtech work, as well as stuff that you have to do at campuses as such, right? So those are some of those things, right? And see, when there's a lot of money in the market, right, you don't care so much in terms of where you're spending, right? I mean, you look at software as a service companies, SaaS companies, basically, right? I mean, you had companies buying all kinds of SaaS tools, right? I mean, I even know SaaS tools that helped employee engagement, in the sense that it was just a randomizer that would set you up with another person in your company for a coffee chat or something, and it was selling at like $20-$25 a month, right? Which is crazy, right? I remember like looking at it and thinking, my God, I mean, this is like peak peak bull run, right? You're paying $25-$29 for something that's just a simple algorithm, right, that just randomizes and sets you up with another person in your company for a chat, right? And obviously when times are hard, I mean, you're not going to be spending on shit like that, right? So yeah, I mean, those were some of those trends, right? I mean, you can't project them out to infinity, right? I mean, I think the smarter people always knew that it was going to end sometime. The party doesn't last all the time. I mean, and you're seeing the beginning of a hangover right now.
So, if I was to ask you, what are the key learnings for startup and established companies from this whole crisis, so that this doesn't happen going forward? What would those key learnings be?
See, we tend to repeat our mistakes cyclically. Okay, so we can be sanguine at the end of a bull run and say that, hey, this will never happen again. But I mean, you always have the trope, right? I mean, this time is different. Whether in finance or tech, I mean, that always happens, right? But I suppose these are times when you're reinforced that you need to focus on a sustainable business model, right? You have to focus on that. I mean, there is no way to hacking business growth, at least not sustainably, right? And I think more importantly, a lot of these tech companies and the startups had this whole bullshit of bring your whole self to work, right? Treating employees as something more than employees. And this was started by Google, right? I mean, yeah, you can do your laundry here, you can have pet care here and whatnot. I mean, don't get me wrong, some of this is really good, right? But I feel like they corrected for that corporate culture of the 60s and the 70s, right? And I think some of that is definitely going to get corrected. I mean, we're going to walk the middle path on that, right? Employees obviously will be first expected to deliver, and then figure all other value added sort of things, right? Yeah, and profits were a four-letter word during these times, right? I mean, during the bull run as such, because everyone thought that if you were looking at profits, then you weren't really going hard enough on growth, right? And things like sustainability, things like, hey, what are your unit economics? All those were bad questions to ask when people were spending like crazy to acquire customers. But this correction has caused a meaningful return to the median in some sense, right? Yeah. So those are some lessons I feel.
Do you think somewhere uh, employee well-being might suffer because many of these value-added, like, because there's a delicate balance, right, in terms of what you want to give to your employees to boost productivity while at the same time ensuring profitability? Do you see that a trend that will come out of it is that companies, to cut costs, will, you know what I mean, it could impact employee well-being itself, the cutback?
Yeah. See, some of these layoffs were long due, right? I mean, I just mentioned those numbers, right? Meta's numbers, for example. Some of these layoffs were long due and it had to happen. I mean, but you just had the situation of, hey, how will it come off, in the press and the media? And, we don't want to look like those kind of people who are laying off people in good times and stuff, right? I mean, some of this just unnecessary bloat, and the companies are using this market situation to sort of trim that down, right? I mean, they had to do that someday, and they're doing it right now. um, And I also feel, like I mentioned previously, right? I mean, I think organizations had overcorrected in terms of culture and well-being and so on and so forth, right? I mean, look at, last year, for example, look at Coinbase or look at Twitter and look at some of the nonsense that employees have been doing, right? Discussing politics on Slack channels, having fundraisers for political parties and causes and whatnot. I mean, that's absolute
Yeah.
bullshit, right? I mean, why should an organization even entertain any of those things, right? So you're going to see those disappear. And sadly, I mean, it will be across the board. I mean, the reasonable person is also going to be affected by all of this stuff, right? But I suppose, this is when the really productive employees, I mean, will stand out, right? I mean, because they're used to a certain work ethic, they're used to a certain discipline, they've always been heads down and execute, right? I mean, those folks will, it's their time to shine right now, and not be bothered about all of the other bullshit. But yeah, I mean, it will affect employees for sure. Yeah.
So this reversal of digitization that is happening post, coming back to normalcy after COVID, uh, how do you see, because you come from a marketing background, right? So how do you see media and ad spends change because of this? Do you think marketers will go back to more traditional mediums and reduce digital spends, or do you generally see marketing spends drop?
So I want to pick up on the reversal of digitization, right? I mean, it's not a reversal per se, right? What we're finding right now is a hybrid. So if earlier, I mean, you worked out of your home 5 days a week, I mean, you will probably be expected to be in the office a couple of days or maybe 3 days in the office, right? I mean,
Correct.
that's what we've settled on, because there are obvious virtues to digitization that you cannot ignore, right? There are obvious virtues to work from home that you cannot ignore. But there's also, like, I mean, what was required was a balance between both these things, and that's what we've seen return, right? I mean, edtech, for example, right? Nobody said that distance learning or digitization, and in terms of courses being delivered by the best of the faculty across the globe was a net negative. It wasn't, right? Nobody also said that what do you say, the best course curriculum, for example, being surfaced from the far corners of the world was a negative. It wasn't, right? We're only saying that, I mean, hey, there is a certain meaning to being in a campus, right, and doing coursework together and so on and so forth, right? So I think you're seeing like a hybrid of that, basically, right? And in terms of marketing and media spends and so on, obviously budgets are cut, right? I mean, I hear about 60, 70, 80% of your marketing budgets being cut, and that's obviously that's going to happen, right? I mean, when in these kind of times, I mean, there are two big places that people look to cut budgets. One is the HR or the employee and the talent budget, or the other is the marketing budget as such, right? And then it's par for the course. I mean, obviously it's going to happen. As a marketer, I always believe that 100% of your budget should be fungible, right? You should not be committed to any one particular channel as such. And that's just me, right? Because I'm not a traditional marketer as such. And so, I mean, I think that at all times, a marketer should be looking for, whatever gives the biggest bang for the buck, right? I mean, it doesn't matter if it's online, or it doesn't matter if you have to hold a pamphlet outside your, prospect's office, right? And so, I mean, will people ignore digital and like look at all these other mediums? Well, I mean, they should have been looking at all these other mediums anyway, right? But yeah, I mean, I do feel that digital spends were getting way out of whack, right? I mean, some of the customer acquisition costs were like, I mean, it's atrocious, right? On Facebook, Instagram, and so on. And I think you will see like a meaningful correction right now, so yeah.
What businesses and industries you think have now suffered a terminal decline, and which ones are those, the new industries that are going to emerge stronger after this pandemic, which are going to resist this downturn?
See, I think businesses across industries that did not have a sound business plan are screwed, right? There is no redemption for them, right? Perhaps, I mean, now is the time to introspect and reflect and figure out their shit. right? Because see, fundamentally, whether it is edtech or fintech or whatever else, right? Unless, I mean, you got screwed over by regulation per se, right? I mean, look at BNPL, for example, right? BNPL, RBI has struck down, how they can operate and so on, right? They've basically said that you can't load your credit lines with, I mean, you can't load your prepaid wallets with credit lines, for example, right? And, unless it's regulation or whatever, I mean, every industry has a reasonable business model, right? I mean, it's just that people kind of ignored it, right? I mean, a business is very simple at some sense, right? I mean, you just have to make more money than you spend, which nobody really bothered to do. And so, I mean, I don't think any one sector is disproportionately affected. But if I were to pick, I mean, so for example, edtech, right? I mean, everyone kind of projected, schools and universities disappearing overnight. That hasn't happened. Obviously, I mean, there is meaning in, being in campuses, so people have returned. Right, some of this BNPL stuff is also gone, right, because interest rates have risen, right, and they're going to be further hiked as well. So there's not enough money, and people don't want to get a 5 lakh loan in 90 seconds anymore, right? For frivolous spending as such. So those kind of companies also have sort of had a hard time, right? And then you look at SaaS is inherently like profitable, right? Unit economics profitable, if you think about it, right? I mean, if you sell to one company or two companies, I mean, you have to make a buck over that, right? I mean, even SaaS companies started like making huge losses in terms of mindless customer acquisition, right? So I mean, in each of these sectors there are companies that can be profitable and sustainable. It's just that nobody really bothered, right? So I would say, the big macro trends do impact companies, right? They do impact industries, but I suppose the biggest impact is not having a focus on that sustainable growth and profitability and so on and so forth, right? And this downturn has made people focus on that. So the companies that will emerge stronger is the folks who always had an eye on sustainability and profitability, right? So those are the companies that will emerge strongly, because see, it isn't that people don't have money to spend right now in terms of, like, let's say VCs and PE firms and so on, right? I mean, they're sitting on cash. They don't know who to deploy on because they don't know if they're going to survive this downturn, right? Now, what is all that cash going to do in about a year's time, right? That cash is going to come back into market and it's going to find the companies that made it through this 1.5 years, right? So I think overall, this is a time to sort of bide it through, right? Focus on your fundamentals, and year and a half, I mean, cash will be back again big time, I think.
It's interesting you mentioned about focus on fundamentals, and there is one more area apart from marketing and human resources that businesses, I think, might be forced to look back into, which is corporate social responsibility and philanthropy. How do you
Yeah.
think that is going to, change?
See, anything which is non-strategic, non-critical will get impacted, right? And CSR was a great initiative, right? And as long as it was regulated, there's no way of escaping that, obviously, right? But all of your discretionary spends are going to end, right? So in that sense, I mean, it will get impacted. So yeah, I mean, it's going to be tough times on that front as well. I mean, and there are companies being built on top of this CSR mandate as well, right? I mean, there's a whole ecosystem, like a cottage industry of folks who rely on that, and they're going to be hit as well, right? So yeah, that's that. It might be tough times for those.
What specific differences do you see between Indian startups and startups in the West, good or bad? What is unique or distinct about Indian startups and the way they operate?
See, I feel like we're very, very nascent. Okay. We have about 20, 25, 30 years of, maybe 20, 25 years of startup action, real startup action happening in India, right? Compare that with, the US, Silicon Valley with Intel and Fairchild and so on. I mean, they have like 50, 60 years of startup action behind them, right? And so we're at the very, very early stages. And so the US is maybe one or two curves ahead of us. And it's helpful for us as well, because we get to leapfrog some of these innovations, right? For example, we leapfrog to mobile, and we'll likely leapfrog to hardware as well, right? Unlike the US. And also we can learn from some of the mistakes that they've made along the way, right? So if you look at, and simply, the cycle of startups that have come up in India over the last 15-20 years itself, I mean, people are way more smarter right now. Entrepreneurs are way more savvier as well, right? I mean, you look at the first wave of startups with the Naukri and the Bharat Matrimony and the Just Dials, or the second wave of startups with Flipkart and Ola, or the third wave that you're seeing with Freshworks and whoever else, right? I think at each point, ambitions have gotten bigger, right? People have gotten way more savvier in terms of like an operating process as such. So we are discovering these playbooks, on the fly, because 10 or 15 years back, I mean, there was no template in terms of, hey, how do you expand internationally, right? How do you build a kick-ass product team, right? These are things that we didn't have a template for, that we do right now, and we've built a native template for that. We're not copying someone else's template as such. So yeah, I mean, that way, I mean, we are behind the curve in the sense that, I mean, in terms of capital or in terms of talent availability and so on, but we're getting there, right? I mean, we're the second or third largest startup ecosystem in the world, right? Depending on what report you read. And if you look at what's happened in China, for instance, right, with the whole implosion of edtech and consumer and so on and so forth, Indian startups are going to be a lot more prominent, right? I mean, there's going to be a lot more capital chasing Indian startups, and I will hazard a guess and say that maybe 23, 24, whenever we're back, right, we will probably, do more than 40 billion of funding in the year, right? What does all this mean? All this means that startups are getting mainstreamed, right? I mean, 15 years back when I joined a startup, I remember my mom was not so happy about it, right? In fact, she kept referring me to this uncle who knew someone in IBM, who knew someone who knew someone in IBM, and would get me a job there, right? But I don't think that's the case today for kids who are out of college, right? I remember when 2012, 2013, when I was trying to get an office for my startup, right? The landlord was like, I don't recognize what you're doing, right? I mean, I don't understand what you're doing, right? I mean, it's not a shop. So what are you guys doing, right? And so he was very jittery about about the advance amount and stuff like that. I mean, today, I mean, it's not so much like that, right? Startups are a mainstream choice, like I said, they're the zeitgeist of the times. And so it's good, it's you need the best and the brightest of people working on new innovation, and startups are pioneers of new innovation, right? So overall, I think it's a net positive.
So there is a lot of churn that happens, employee churn that happens in startups, right? So how easy is it in a startup ecosystem, especially in a place like Bangalore? Let's say someone loses a job, to quickly find a job in some other startup or even for that matter, many times founders whose businesses flounder if something goes wrong. How easy or quickly do they get reabsorbed? Is that why I'm asking you this? Is because since the failure rate is so high, and acceptance of failure in our culture is generally not very good. It's a very risk averse culture, right, across India. So how is that really in the place where all the action is happening?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I think I've seen like a 180 shift in that, right? 5-6 years back, when I wound up my startup and I was looking for a job, it was way more harder, right? Because there wasn't a job like a generalist as such, right? I mean, there were very few jobs like that, and you had to know someone who knew someone, and you had to connect with the right folks and say the right things and whatnot, right? I mean, today it isn't like that. People look kindly upon founders who've failed, right, and really value the skills that they bring to the table, right? The fact that they can close the loop irrespective of what it requires, whether it's sales, product, marketing, tech, or whatever, right? And so those are very valuable skills. In fact, I mean, people happily flaunt their startup failures, right? That they started X, Y, and Z, and then raised some amount of money, and then they folded. right? So it's relatively easier, I would say. See, this whole employee churn as well, right? I mean, Infi TCS fires a shit ton of people as well, but you don't hear about them as much because, I mean, they've managed the press very well, you know. So I'm not really sold on the fact that, startups really fire as many people, right? I mean, of course, I mean, the employee base is lower compared to the larger firms, but even as a percentage, yeah, I mean, I don't think so, right? I mean, or it would at best be comparable, I think, right? uh, it's a lot more easier, man. I mean, it's become a mainstream choice right now, right? So it's a lot easier to find jobs. And now I won't I won't gloss over this and say that now is a great time to find jobs. 2021 was ridiculous, right? I mean, people, I know people who moved at 30, 50, 100% hikes, right? I know people who worked, two jobs, three jobs, basically moonlighting, all the way, right? So all of that has obviously tempered down, right? I mean, right now, it's not a great time to be out in the market looking for a job, right? Because budgets are cut, and there are startups who are hiring, but then, they're not really hiring at those 2021 ridiculous levels, right? And also, I mean, salaries have taken a much needed correction as well. So it is, I mean, relative to 2021, yes, I mean, it's not that great, but then, I mean, startups are always hiring, right? I mean, so yeah, that's what I would say.
You mentioned moonlighting. What is your take on this issue? Because a couple of IT companies, I think Wipro and Infosys, fired a lot of
Yeah,
employees, and I think the PF, the Provident Fund account, I think helped them track,
yeah.
moonlighting employees. So, what is your take on moonlighting?
See,
To what
here I
extent
would
should it be permissible, and where should the boundary stop?
see, I would separate gigs from, um, I would separate gigs from jobs from passion work, right? I mean, so I would separate all of these. I mean, sometimes they get lumped in together. Now, someone who has actively gone and, gotten another job, right, with a PF and with insurance and all of that stuff, I mean, in my books that is not done, right? I mean, because you've signed a contract with an employee, with an employer, and that's a breach of contract at the very least, right? I mean, hey, if you have the balls, I mean, you should negotiate with that employer and say that, look, yeah, I mean, I'm that good that, I can give you all of the work that you need, maybe in 20, 25 hours of work. I don't need to, do the standard 40 or 60 or 80 hours of work, not 80, but, 40 hours of work or something of that sort. So you should just negotiate that straight up, right? I mean, if you don't, then obviously then you're cheating, right? There's no other way of putting it. Right, but someone who is maybe nursing a D2C idea on the side, and, like, who's got a website where he has to spend few hours a week or whatever, I mean, I don't consider that, particularly bad as such. I mean, in fact, I mean, it could be really good as well for employers as well, right? I mean, because here's a person who's picking up skills outside of their domain as well, right? Obviously, running a business teaches you a whole lot of things, right? And also more stable as well, because this person now requires your job, right, to keep that passion project or keep that D2C business going. So all in all, I feel it's also, I mean, I think some of these employment contracts deserve a relook, right? Some of these have been drafted maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago, right? And those conventions no longer hold true right now. So more and more of these contracts will have to accommodate gig work, will have to accommodate people. See, I know some 10x coders, for example, right? I mean, the typical 10x programmers who don't want to be tethered to a particular company, right? They're very confident that they can, finish all of their, work in maybe a day's time, and don't want to pretend that they're working the rest 4 or 5 days or 4 days of the week, right? What are you going to do about this person? Are you going to lose this person, right? And I know genuinely people like this, right? People who are too good, right? I mean, it's another thing that 90% of Bangalore tech janta thinks that they're Mark Zuckerberg, right? Which they're not, clearly. But I mean, there are these exceptional types, right? And I think you need to find a great way. You need to find a more reasonable way to measure work than hours spent, right? I guess it depends on the employment contracts. So I did an episode on this sometime back on Bharat Varta, on this whole changing economy and the newer types of work that's emerging and so on. So that was an interesting conversation. Maybe we'll link to that in the description. Yeah.
Sure. And I mean, I hope that in this whole debate and discussion of moonlighting, at least the gig part of it remains out of the purview of moonlighting, because otherwise, I think it will really cross the jurisdiction into the employee's personal space and life as such, right? I mean,
No, for sure. I mean, see, the thing is that, you know, to what do you owe an employer, right? Let's ask that fundamental question, right? You're owed a certain amount of time and a certain amount of work, right? And I think you need to draw hard boundaries there, right? The problem that's happened over the last 10 or 15 years with this whole, internet work, right? Let's all call us knowledge workers, internet workers, whatever, is that you're available 24/7, right? I mean, we've all had to work maybe long hours. We've all had to, work on the weekends and so on, right? Contrast that with, my father who worked a blue collar job, right? I mean, there was no way he could do work from home per se, right? He had to be on the floor, right? So I think the contracts are, like I said, the contracts have to sort of reinvent themselves. We have to redraw them per se, right? So I think in the meantime, I mean, it's up to you and me to kind of draw these hard boundaries, right? But I always feel, I mean, even when I hire people as well, I always hire people who have an interesting life outside of their professional work, right?
oh,
And it always makes them more accomplished in work, right? Because see, when you do the 0 to 1 on anything, right, whether it is a band that you have, or whether it is like a podcast, or whether even it is a small business that you run, etc., I think it imputes a lot of skills to you. I mean, you acquire all of these skills that don't come up in normal work as such, right? And so it's fantastic. So I in fact seek out such people really for my team as such, and we have a fair number of people who have these passions, right? They either so there's someone on my team who does storytelling for children, right? And that's her passion project, right? There's someone on my team, in fact, I mean, who just left my team, who runs, I mean, who was part of a very successful band, right? I mean, these are things that definitely add to a person's, character, a person's skill set, and so on. Right. Obviously, I mean, you have to figure, how much time they're able to give to one or more of their vocations and passions and so on. I mean, but people do find a balance, I suppose.
there is this whole trend that came, and it became quite viral, of quiet quitting. I mean, just do your job and log off. Don't go the extra mile. Don't cross the line. Just whatever has been told, deliver that and get done with it. It's a form of, like, I don't do anything extra type of a situation. What do you think about this? Why do you think this has come, and do you think it's a good thing?
See, again, I'm going to get a lot of flack for this, but I do agree with Elon, right? If you're going to do the best work of your life, you can't be passive about it. You can't do it from an arm's distance, right? I mean, you will have to put your heart and soul into it. Okay. And I don't know. I mean, there are people who think that, work is just one facet of their life, right? And they're happy doing just enough. But that's a conscious choice, right? I mean, no judgment here, right? I mean, that's a deliberate choice that they've made to privilege certain other aspects of their life, and that's fine, right? It's just that I feel professionally, if you aren't giving your heart and soul to something, right, if you aren't all in per se, right, you can't really grow. Okay. And so those others shouldn't really question the fact that someone else who's probably doing that is getting ahead, right? Because that's just the nature of the game, right? So yeah, I mean, in that sense, I think Elon is a great correction to the big tech folks as well, right? I mean, with what he's done with Twitter, right, firing 50 or maybe 75% of the workforce, and I think Twitter product is way better today compared to even a month and a half, 2 months back. I wrote this article for Swaraja. I think what was it? Maybe about 7-8 years back, right?
Okay.
When Twitter was in deep shit, and I'd argued for some of these things, right? How Twitter has to sort of productize and monetize and so on. And I see, like, over the last 7-8 years, I mean, whoever's used Twitter, right, know that precious little happened. I mean, nothing happened really. Very superficial things, right? But I guarantee you, I mean, just looking at the pace of pace at which they're shipping over the last, like, month since Elon took over, I guarantee you in another 1 year it'll look very, very different, very, very different, right? um, yeah, I mean, so much needed correction on that front by Elon, I would say.
Okay. And as a trend further downstream from quiet quitting was this whole thing of the great resignation. And interestingly, this happened before this whole job loss thing, which we have heard in the last month or so. Before this, there was like employees were quitting jobs, right? And what do you think about that? And do you think, I don't think India saw that trend, but it was more of an American
Yeah, it
and the
was an
Western
American
world.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. What do you think about that? The great resignation.
See, COVID kind of struck people really hard, right? I mean, I don't know how many deaths in the US, probably 1 million deaths. I don't know, right? It does bring things in perspective. I mean, it makes you reprioritize certain things in life. And people did figure that, there were some things more important than the job that they were doing, right? And yeah, 2020, 2021, I mean, people didn't know how things will pan out, and that's one of the most amazing human triumphs of ingenuity and innovation we've seen over the last couple of years, that we've been able to invent a vaccine, and take care of people as such, right? So I think, given that, I mean, people really reprioritized what they wanted in life. And of course, with work from home, with flexible work, and so on, I mean, people found different gigs, right? And people realized that, hey, I mean, why am I working for this company a few miles away from my house, when I could probably be working remotely for some other company, maybe in a different state or a different country, right? And yeah, I mean, and that's really what happened. It was a mixture of all of these that you saw the employment numbers. I mean, the resignation numbers in the US peak, right? I think it was 2021 or so. So yeah, I mean, obviously, there was a lot of free cash in the market as well. So people kind of thought that they could take a chill pill for a while. But yeah, I mean, that's really what happened.
Okay. So, lastly, what future trends do you see emerging at the workplace and in terms of organizational behavior, corporate culture? What future trends do you see emerge from these last 2, 3 years going forward?
See, I think we have the greatest opportunity in front of us, right? When you look at basic capacity, infrastructure, access, the way it has grown, right? And innovative companies will continue to build amazing products and services that all of us will experience and enjoy, right? And it's the best time to be alive, I would say, right? So I think, whether you're an employer or an employee, I mean, this is an important time to exist. And as an employer, I would say, focus on sustainability, focus on growth, focus on building a company that lasts 10, 20, 50 years, right? Long after the founders as well. Because that's how you build legacy, right? Think of Apple, think of, the others that you look up to, right? Tata or whoever else. And as an employee, I think now is the time to do the most meaningful work of your life, because why wouldn't you, right? So if you are going to spend even 40 hours at work, I mean, make those 40 hours count, work on tough challenges. And if you are considering starting up, perhaps now is a great time as well, right? And again, I mean, I've interviewed maybe 200 plus founders on the podcast. Some of them, have built mammoth companies, right? None of them just, like, almost 0% of them just decided one day and then took off, right? I mean, they always calibrate risks, right? People think that entrepreneurs are risk takers and so on. Yes, they are, but they also calibrate their risks, right? I mean, they had something before they decided to jump in with both feet. And so I think now is a good time to start thinking of those passion projects and those ideas that you have, to start exploring them, right? Because, as I mentioned, give it a year and a half, capital is going to be back big time. I'm going to stick my neck out and say that, right? 23, 24, maybe if not 23, 24 is going to be a big fundraise year, right? There's going to be a lot of capital and a lot less companies, out there to fund. So this could be a good time, in that sense. Maybe a time for quiet introspection, reflection, to figure what next. I would say.
Great. With that, we come to the end of this podcast. It's been a very fascinating and insightful chat with you, Roshan. So yeah, I would also ask the audience to check out Roshan's both of his podcasts, the Startup Operator as well as the Bharat Varta podcast. He's doing some really interesting stuff.
Hey, thanks, Vineet. This was fascinating. Thank you.
With that, we come to the end of this episode. Guys, please do comment, like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, signing off.